Take another question.
No more questions. I'm so sorry. But I am very pleased. Actually, a round of applause for our panelists. I am very pleased to actually introduce to you a force of nature, a true champion for the people. I mean, champion. When I first got here in 1997, I had the privilege of actually watching Congresswoman Maxine single-handedly lead the first ever HIV/AIDS investment in communities of color. And it was an action that was never introduced on the floor of the U.S. Congress. It was never considered in a committee or subcommittee of the U.S., any of the committees, and yet she was able to get it done. And so with that, she's been a champion in she's creator of the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. She got the portions of the Dodd-Frank bill that speak to race and ethnicity. I mean, we can go down the list. She's been a champion on entrepreneurship and minority-owned businesses and opportunities, black-owned banks. You name it, you go down the list, she has been a champion. And so it is my distinct honor and pleasure to bring before you today the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee on the House side, Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I know that you've been here for a long time. You've heard a lot, and I'm going to try and condense some of the information that I have, but let me start out by thanking you, the Center for Global Policy Solutions, for holding this Color of Wealth Summit and for inviting me to participate. You have put together an amazing program to educate members, leaders, experts, and anyone who will listen about the disparity between white households and households of color, otherwise known as the racial wealth gap. This racial wealth gap is nothing short of an economic crisis, and this country is in urgent need of credible solutions. And the first step to a solution is, of course, recognizing and acknowledging the problem. That is why this summit and the work that you all do is so important. We keep hearing over and over how the recession is over, that everything is fixed, and the economy has recovered, but we all know that isn't true for our communities of color. We know people in our communities are still struggling. But the reason we keep hearing that the country's financial situation has improved is because the average citizen, even many of my colleagues in Congress, do not understand the full story. That is why this year I introduced a resolution that was co-sponsored by more than 50 of my colleagues called the Wealth Gap Resolution, that does the same thing you all are trying to do here today: bring attention to the racial wealth gap and call on Congress and our leaders to address it. The resolution identifies the racial wealth gap as an issue of national economic security and captures the stark disparities that exist in this country in real numbers and real terms. The statistics that are included in the resolution are identical to the information you share in your publications, even though I know I don't need to remind the people in this room of these alarming numbers. Some of them will always bear repeating. African-American households have 15 times less wealth than white households, and Latino households have 10 times less wealth than white households. African-Americans have $100,000 less in retirement savings than white households, and for every $1 of white household wealth, communities of color have less than 7 cents. So just like so many of you in this room, I believe these numbers are simply unacceptable. And to me, they aren't just numbers. These statistics aren't just saying that communities of color have less money in their pockets. They're saying that communities of color have less opportunity to send their kids to college, to retire comfortably, less capital to start their own businesses, fewer opportunities to obtain good-paying jobs, and are less likely to survive the next financial crisis. So when we talk about the racial wealth gap and economic equality, we're just not talking about having as much as the other guy. We're talking about pulling families out of poverty, keeping them out of poverty, and ensuring that their children and their grandchildren never fall back into poverty again. These issues are at the heart of my work, And as ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, I've dedicated much of my time and effort to protect the work we accomplished to reform the financial services industry with Dodd-Frank, the law established in the wake of the financial crisis, and I'm painfully aware of the loss of wealth that communities of color suffered during that time. Now, we all know the racial wealth gap isn't new and that it isn't accidental. It was caused by historically discriminatory laws implemented and institutionalized at all levels of government. So the financial crisis and the housing collapse didn't cause the racial wealth gap, but definitely made the situation worse. This crisis led to a recession and nearly a deep depression affecting markets all over the world. The worst part about it is that it was the result of shameful greed of the financial institutions that promoted harmful, predatory products such as the no-doc or no documentation loans, interest-only loans, all kind of exotic products that specifically targeted our communities of color and some of the most vulnerable people in our society. African Americans who were lured into these predatory financial products and contracts quickly became trapped in a cycle of increasing payments and surging debt until eventually many lost their homes to foreclosure. So when the recession hit and the housing market collapsed, so too did the wealth in our communities, having never really gained access to other markets. The majority of our wealth was and still remains in our homes. As a result, during the recession, African Americans lost 52% of their wealth, and Hispanics lost 66% of the wealth in their respective communities. So we need to keep telling this story and are talking about these numbers. My next step, of course, is to join with members and all of those who claim that they care about this issue, and some of them who participated in this summit today, to continue to introduce legislation that curbs the use of predatory products, expands access to home ownership, and address the disparity in education, the opportunity for good-paying jobs, and any other factors that have contributed to the widening wealth gaps. Now, before I talk a little bit about one of the areas that I'm going to pay a lot of attention to, when I talk about the issues of the wealth gap having been around historically, I want to tell you that when I was in the California State Assembly some years ago, many years ago, I created a piece of legislation known as AB 1933. AB 1933 was then the affirmative action legislation that opened up government to contracting opportunities. And we were very successful because what we did was we opened up the ability for many of our financial services individuals who happen to be African Americans on Wall Street and in Chicago and other places to participate in the management of the Public Employees Retirement Fund and the State Teachers Retirement Fund. Well, this was a big move, and we created what was known as an emerging market. And we called in basically minorities and women from all over the country who came and got involved in this, and many of them not only expanded their businesses, but created a lot of wealth and created jobs, et cetera. That's no more in California. After that, it was wiped out by another piece of legislation, I think it was AB 209, when the big conversation emerged about how unfair affirmative action was, how it benefited people who were should not have the advantage of any kind of affirmative action, people who didn't deserve it, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was a big effort, and we saw how well it could work. And so this has been what has informed me in a lot of the other efforts that I've attempted or either I've been involved in. It was mentioned here earlier that I created something called OMWI in all of the financial services agencies in government. And so what we did was we kind of segued from talking about affirmative action, and we started to talk about diversity. And so OMWI was created around the words of diversity, et cetera. And we basically said, then every one of our financial services agency whether we were talking about the SEC, the FDIC, the Treasury, the Feds, et cetera, they had to have an office. They had to have an OMWI office with a director. And that director and that staff would have the responsibility for outreach in jobs, but also in contracting. And we included in that the opportunity for them to resist the response to requests for proposal on contracts that did not show diversity in them. Well, I want you to know we're still working with that. We've created that. It was new, it was difficult, and some of those who, managed to be able to become directors was faced with new power and new influence and was not sure how to execute. And so we work and we get in roundtables and we're saying to some of the directors that the Omni directors have to report directly to the top of the agency. So the top of the agency will be able to answer our questions when they come into our committees on any other matters, and we have an opportunity to challenge them on what was going on with Omni. Well, I talk about Omni just a little bit to know that when we talk about optimism and what we can do a lot, and we should be optimistic. We know it's a struggle, and we know it's a fight, but we can't back away. We can't give up because of what has been done in the past. We, in my office, we look at every opportunity. When we get involved in mergers, like the merger of Comcast, NBC Universal, because we know that, number one, that they don't have people of color in top management jobs. We know that they are making tremendous dollars off of the African-American community. And we also know that the contracting opportunities are non-existent. And so the work that we did on that merger, even though there was a little bit of diversion in the way that they signed off on what was a memorandum of understanding, that really when you take a look at it, it was not enforceable, and they perhaps did it with people who didn't really understand how to negotiate and make sure there's accountability. But out of it, we did get some show and tell. MSNBC, Sharpton, Magic Johnson owns a channel, P. Diddy owns a channel. Now, I question whether some of those channels will be able to continue because, they have to have placement, they have to have money for development and all of that. And I've been looking at some of them. I've been looking at Revolt. I've been looking at those channels, and I know that unless we do some other things, they're not going to be successful. They will fail. But we have to keep working on it. It's very important that we do this. And we have been doing this for years. Many of you can remember the work that we did with black farmers, where farmers in this country had not been able to basically be treated fairly in terms of how the Department of Agriculture supported their ability to put those seeds in the ground and to grow those crops and to export or sell or whatever. And we worked on that for years, and we had to do double work on it. We had some successes. There's still some work that needs to be done on it, but I kind of mention all of this because oftentimes we think of creating wealth in terms of making sure that we increase minimum wage. We got to do that, but ladies and gentlemen, that's not going to close the wealth gap. That's very important, but that's not going to do it. And so we've got to think more about what Mr. Carr was talking about, for example. What's wrong? What has gone wrong in these housing markets? And how do we really reform Fannie and Freddie? Now, some of us believe Fannie and Freddie doesn't need that much reforming, that it works pretty well, and that we know what happened during the subprime meltdown and the crisis of 2008, and we know the challenges that they faced in terms of some of the financial institutions who were putting those exotic products on the market and how they threatened Fannie and Freddie and said, if you don't take our junk, if you don't take this mess that we're creating with people creating mortgages out of the back of the cars, we're going to stop doing business with you. And Fannie and Freddie had to think about its investors and on and on and on. We can straighten out some of that. But right now, Fannie and Freddie are doing so well, they're dumping money into our federal treasury. And, it's a sign that we need to stop thinking about all of these ideas about a complicated reform, it's going to be hard to replace what Fannie and Freddie was able to do. We need to clean up some things. We need to make sure that the platforms make good sense. But I want you to know the reason we have not reformed Fannie and Freddie is because we don't know how to do it. It's just that big and it's just that important. But let me go on to talk a little bit more about these contracting opportunities in federal government alone. Well, maybe I'm talking about local government and state government. You know, we had this big stimulus bill that we passed. Remember the stimulus package that we passed? I think it was following the so-called recession. And the whole idea was we were going to fund municipalities, we were going to fund states with so-called shelf-ready projects. Remember that? If we had cities and counties and state government that had shelf-ready projects, the stimulus bill that we put out was supposed to go to these communities to help fund these projects. Now, what's wrong with the way federal government sends money to cities and states and counties? Not only dealing with something like the stimulus bill, but in the way that we do a lot, whether it's CDBG or many of the other programs that we have. I'll tell you what's wrong with it. If you're not the Association of General Contractors, part of the old boys club, with enough money to put together a 100-page proposal in 24 hours, you're not going to get any of that money. And so our local jurisdictions have not assisted closing the wealth gap or participation by minorities, by African Americans, by ensuring that they have processes that are included in the way that you respond to requests for proposal that would allow them to really participate rather than the good old boys being able to use their networks and their connections and all of the money that they have in their responses to requests for proposals. The other thing that federal government does and cities and states do is the way that they package the proposals. They package them in certain ways that if you're a small business or you're a medium-sized business, you don't get to play. As a matter of fact, they indicate in many of these proposals that you have to have so much under money in your business before you can even apply. And this is particularly true in financial services. And one of the things we have to do is pay more attention to how you break this up. Because I think that much of it is done for convenience purposes. It's all right if you only have to deal with one company, even though they're making millions, billions of dollars. But when you have to break up those contracts so that you're dealing with 10, 15, 20, 30, 100, it means that you have to deal with more people and you have to have more oversight, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing that we have to do in contracting. I believe that there is so much money in contracting at every level of government. We have not began to tap the possibility. And so we've got to use these contracting opportunities. Well, Mr. Carr and others in here know, we bailed out the financial institutions of America with over $700 billion. A lot of people made money in consulting, in lawyers' fees, on and on and on. But we convened 3 big meetings and called in, asset managers and others who are dealing in financial services, and we introduced them to the Treasury and others, and they were so pleased because they didn't have a database of minorities and women that we were introducing them to people who could, deal with, their needs. But guess what? We didn't get it. We only got a small amount of that money that went to minority firms. And a lot of this has to do with legislation that has to be produced in order to force some things to happen. But much of it has to do with the bully pulpit from the highest level of government. And that is, whether it starts in the White House or whether it is those people who appointed by the president, as the secretaries of these agencies, there has to be a real understanding of the expectations to correct some of this mess and to make some changes and to open up these opportunities. And we have got to say it, and we've got to say it loudly, and we've got to say it clearly, and we cannot back away from it. And so, it was also mentioned that one of the programs that the Neighborhood Stabilization Project that we did, well, I tell you what we did. We had 10 African-American members on the Financial Services Committee, and we just walked out one day and stopped and said, we're not going to support even the stimulus package at that time until we deal with what we're going to do about helping to put some of these communities back together. Communities that now had been devastated because of the number of foreclosures that not only caused our families to lose their homes, but really negatively impacted the entire community because the equity and the value of these homes was reduced because of all of the boarded up homes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when we went outside and we met with a lot of folks whose names you would know, we literally said we're not going back in and we're not going to take up anything else until we get this money. And so we used our leverage as the members of that Financial Services Committee to get substantial money in billions. I think we ended up in somewhere between $6 and $8 billion for the Neighborhood Stabilization Project. And so I guess what I'm saying to those of you who have decided that you're going to put time and effort into this work, I want you to be optimistic. And I'm going to share with you a few things that helps me every day when I get up after having had a long day of disappointments. Throughout my lifetime, I've been a part of some terrific struggles. When I served as a member of the California State Assembly, I again implemented that affirmative action law which opened up contracting. It has since been, diminished, but, I'm still looking at what we can do with PERS and STIRS to get some of that back, even from afar. Also, during my time as a legislator, I implemented legislation. Doesn't have anything quite to do with what we were talking about with the wealth gap. But it ended the insurance company's unconscionable denial of coverage for reconstructive surgery for women who have undergone mastectomies. Prior to this legislation, these companies classified this surgery, a life-saving procedure often required for women fighting breast cancer, as cosmetic and elective, and did not cover any of the costs. And folks said to me at the time, one of the male members of the assembly said, well, maybe it's an issue that should be addressed, but I don't think those of us who work in this area feel very comfortable taking up that kind of legislation. And besides, the insurance companies are so powerful, they're never going to literally pay for the buildup after mastectomies. I mean, they consider this cosmetic, and they don't have to do it. Well, we got it passed, and it led legislation in this country so that legislatures all over the country then adopted this legislation, and that's why women now who are the victims of breast cancer can have these build up after the mastectomy. Another thing that was kind of extraordinary, and it gives me hope and helps to inspire me, is in addition to the domestic work that we do a lot of international work, some of us who are involved in concerns about African countries and the Caribbean and Central America and all of that. And in 2004, I fought against a coup d'etat in Haiti, and I just really understood the history of what was going on there and what Haitians had been subjected to, and all of that history about how this little country fought against slavery, literally, and won, and what had happened as a result of that. And I understand what happened, with the dictators, and the fact that President Aristide had come in with a whole different approach, believing in democracy and wanting to get rid of some of the policies that certainly had ruled Haiti for so long. But they organized, and, you know, very rich people came in to get rid of him because, in fact, he was cutting off their ability to make money on the backs of poor Haitians. And so they pulled a coup d'etat on him. They pulled a coup d'etat, and they took him up into the Central African Republic. And I can remember talking to the then Secretary of State and saying, why did you let that happen? And I understand that somehow we might have been party to that, based on the way the airplane was sent to Haiti and took him out, and he ended up in the Central African Republic. And I was told at the time, well, you know, why don't the Congress do something about it? And I said, you know what I'm going to do? We're going to do something about it. And so I got with Randall Robinson at Trans-Africa, and I got with the attorney who had been representing Aristide, and we chartered a plane. And we went to the Central African Republic. And we were met by young men on pickup trucks with AK-47s, et cetera, et cetera. We got in there. They told us they were going to keep us overnight, that we could not leave. I said, if you keep me overnight, you will have kidnapped a member of Congress, and they will come get you. And so we turned them around. They said, okay. And the poor president at the time, who was the president of what was then a coup d'etat government itself, basically said, and it was kind of pitiful, can you help us with the World Bank? Can you do something to get us some support? We have nothing up here. On and on and on. I said, can't make you any promises, but if you let me go, I'll try. And so, and so we got out of there, and we returned Aristide then to Jamaica, where they kept him until Mbeki was elected in South Africa and took over the government, and they took him in, and he stayed there for a number of years. He's back in Haiti now. But I tell you these stories because nothing is impossible. And of course, the last story that I'll end with was mentioned here today, and that is Nelson Mandela. When I was in the California State Assembly, I authored the legislation that divested all of our firms that were doing business in South Africa from our pension funds. And we basically said, we're not going to do any business with you if you're doing business there. We initiated legislation that took fire in legislatures in addition to what was being done in the Congress of the United States. And we got that divestment going. And so we worked very hard to get Nelson Mandela out of jail, work with an African National Congress, in our own legislature in California. When the opposition to Nelson Mandela came, Mr. Buthelezi, who was fighting against Nelson Mandela, we walked out because he was brought in by the right-wing conservatives, et cetera. We put up a fight. For years, you know, in that fight, we sent out press releases every day, educating people about what apartheid was, introducing them to Winnie Mandela, you know, telling them what the ANC was about. All of those people had been in prison, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, he was released from prison. You know the story. We brought him into this country. We had big welcoming ceremonies for him. We put together in California, in Los Angeles, the Coliseum with 90,000 people in it. You know, welcoming him in. It was happening in New York and some other places. And then, of course, we all who had worked very hard ended up in South Africa at the inauguration. A sight to behold. Leaders, not African leaders, but leaders from all over the world who came to be a part of and to witness this inauguration, just walking past you one by one. And we saw the formations in the sky of planes that had been part of the Air Force that helped to support apartheid, now saluting Nelson Mandela, the president of South Africa. And so I'm inspired by all of this. Some people say it's just, you're just crazy, you know what I mean? You enter into places you should not go. You don't know what you're doing. You're taking on impossible tasks. Larry Parks comes into my office all the time, and we talk about all of this. And in addition to all of the things that we're talking about doing, he adds more to it and saying, yeah, and I think we can do this, and I think we can do that. Ladies and gentlemen, it can be done. But it can't be done if you have fear, if you allow yourselves to be intimidated, or you think you are so secure in who you are and what you have and what you do, you don't have to worry about anybody else. Well, I want to tell you something. For everybody who thinks that way, you're never going to be secure. You're never going to be absolutely comfortable. I don't have to talk to you about what's going up in Baltimore. I don't have to talk to you what has gone up in New York or Florida. Or I don't have to talk to you what happened behind Rodney King in California. Now, what I'm pleased about and what helps me to be optimistic is this. I'm hearing finally some new voices that talk about rioting and talk about what is going on with this kind of resistance, with this kind of protesting. When I took the national stage to talk about hopelessness and despair, and to try and describe what was happening to people who were being called thugs and criminals, who were not thugs and criminals, but found themselves in situations, and the way that I describe it, they took me apart for it. I said, you know, that woman who passed a broken window, broken in by somebody else, she didn't do it, and there was a pair of shoes that fit her child, and she just said, well, she's not a crook, she's not a criminal, but she's someone who did not have the basic necessities of life. And there were many people like that who were stealing food, who were stealing meat. And what I tried to describe was the isolation and the despair and the hopelessness. And I talked about how we should be addressing, we didn't call it the wealth gap then, we just talked about poverty, and we talked about isolation. And of course, I was demonized. I was demonized in every right-wing radio, television station, what have you. They said I caused the riots, simply by the way that I talked. And so, but what I heard in recent days are people talking about hopelessness and despair. I'm encouraged. If you listen to Hillary Clinton's statement, you say, well, maybe she's running for president, but when you're running for president, you're a little bit more careful. You don't step too far out there, but she stepped beyond where a lot of people running for office would go to talk about prison reform, she talked about. And she talked about investment in human potential. And I'm hearing some of the commentators, even on CNN, talking about Cuomo has done a pretty good job beginning to talk about hopelessness and despair. Now, some of them are trying to get some kind of prize because they are challenging, you know, the mayor and this and that and the other. Well, those people who are doing that are not good journalists anyway, and they don't come through quite right. They don't have credibility, and they can keep going in that direction, but I hear things beginning to happen, and I hear people beginning to talk about what is going on. And finally, in a speech that I did this past weekend up in Allentown on an interview or something that I did where they were trying to trap me about talking about supporting rioting and criminals and thugs, etc. I just quoted Martin Luther King. And I said, Martin Luther King said, rioting is the voice of the unheard. Thank you very much.